The Alpha King's muzzled beast hadn't let anyone near him for years, until she removed the muzzle with her bare hands. A true story. There is a moment that changes things. Not always a big dramatic moment, not always a loud one. Sometimes it is the smallest possible thing. A metal clasp giving way after being stuck for years. A gate clicking open in a storm. A woman choosing to stand still in the dark when every part of her body is telling her to run. This story is about one of those moments. But to feel the full weight of it, you have to start much further back. You have to understand who she was before that night. And you have to understand him, the wolf they called Kodiak, and what a long and terrible stretch of years had done to a creature that was once the most powerful animal in his entire world. Her name was Nadia, 27 years old. A biology teacher at a public high school in a quiet, ordinary town in Oregon, the kind of town that sits between mountains and farmland and has one good coffee shop and a library that stays open late on Fridays. She rented a small house on a side street. She drove a second-hand car that made a rattling noise her mechanic described as concerning but not yet urgent. She ate toast most mornings because toast was fast, and she was usually running a few minutes behind schedule, and toast asked nothing of her. She had a shelf of books on her bedroom wall, most of them read so many times the spines had cracked, and she had repaired several with tape, which looked terrible, and which she could not bring herself to care about. She was not famous, and not wealthy, and not someone whose name appeared in any news story before this one. She was, as she will tell you herself, just a person who showed up. But that, showing up, turned out to be the whole thing. She had grown up in a family that did not have a lot of money, but had a great deal of routine. Her mother had made breakfast every morning at the same time, and dinner every evening at the same time, and had said goodnight to each of her daughters in exactly the same words every night for as long as Nadia could remember. Nadia had absorbed this, the value of the repeated small thing, without being conscious of absorbing it. Routines, her mother used to say, are how you prove to yourself and to other people that you mean what you say. Anyone can show up once. Showing up every day is something different. Nadia had believed this completely, and it had become part of how she operated in the world, in the classroom, and everywhere else. This was probably also where the reading aloud had come from. Her mother had read aloud to her daughters every evening when they were small, and even after they were old enough to find it embarrassing and said so, she continued reading aloud to herself in the kitchen while she cooked, a low, even voice, whatever she happened to have open on the counter. When Nadia moved out and lived alone and found herself reading aloud to her own walls, she understood that she had not developed a habit. She had inherited one. There is something specific about the way Nadia moved through rooms that people who knew her would mention if asked to describe her. She moved slowly, not sluggishly, not without energy, but with a considered, unhurried quality that felt deliberate, like she was in no rush to leave where she was. Her students noticed it in how she moved between lab stations during class. She did not drift past them. She stopped. She looked at what they were actually doing, not the version of it she had assumed before arriving. She asked one small, specific question and then moved on. She was genuinely interested in the actual thing happening in front of her rather than the version of it she had already decided she was going to find. This habit, unhurried, present attention, was something she could never fully explain when people asked about her teaching approach. She did not have a methodology. She had a practice. The practice was, be where you are. Look at what is actually there. Most of the rest follows from that, or enough of it does. It sounds simple. Like most things that are genuinely useful, it is considerably harder to do consistently than it sounds. The town she lived in was the kind of town that appears in the background of other stories, the place the protagonist is from before they go somewhere more significant, or the place they end up when the more significant place gets to be too much. It was not a bad town. A river ran along its lower edge, cold and fast and clear, popular with fly fishermen who drove up from the city on weekends. A hardware store had been in the same family for 3 generations. The high school where Nadia taught sat on the north end of town on a slight rise, old brick with newer additions, surrounded by a parking lot that flooded every February. Most things about the town were like that, a little imperfect, very familiar, accumulated over decades rather than designed. She had been teaching for 5 years and she loved the work. Genuinely, not in the way people sometimes love jobs they have invested too much in to admit might be wrong for them. She loved the moment when something clicked for a student who had been struggling with it for weeks. She loved the quiet conversation at the end of class with someone who had hung back because they had a question they did not want to ask in front of the whole room. She cared about her students in the practical, daily, unglamorous way that good teachers do. She remembered small things about each of them, noticed shifts in their behavior and mood, adjusted and adjusted again when something was not reaching someone. She paid attention in the way that paying attention is itself a full-time occupation, but by the 5th year, paying that kind of attention had started to cost more than it used to, not because the students had changed or the work had become worse. Just because giving that much of yourself to that many people over that many years takes something from you in amounts small enough that you do not notice the deficit accumulating until one day you look up and realize the tank is nearly empty. She was not depressed. She was not unable to function or unable to feel anything. She was more like a phone running too many applications for too long that has finally dimmed its own screen to save what battery remains. Everything still worked. Everything just required slightly more effort than it used to. Her older sister Priya noticed before Nadia fully admitted it to herself. Priya was 3 years older, a dentist, and the kind of person who says the true thing directly, without spending much time cushioning it first. She came to visit one Sunday evening in early May. The windows were open and the warm evening air was coming through, and the distant smell of rain on its way. Priya looked at her sister across the kitchen table and said, "You look like you have been running on fumes for a while now." Nadia said she was fine. Priya said, "I know you are fine. Fine is not what I asked. I asked if you were actually okay," and Nadia opened her mouth and reached for the word yes, and found that she could locate the idea of it, but not the substance of it, not in a way that felt honest, which was, in itself, the answer. The sabbatical option had been available in Nadia's contract for 2 years without her using it. Teachers in her district could take up to a year of unpaid leave for personal renewal, once every 7 years. She had been eligible for 2 years and had not applied because there was always a reason not to. A class she was mid-unit with, the sense that the timing was not right, the general feeling that she could not afford to stop. After the conversation with Priya, she looked at the option differently. Not as something she was choosing, as something that had been waiting for her to stop making excuses. She applied at the end of the school year. The district approved it. She left. The first 2 weeks she mostly slept and went for long, slow walks in the morning and reorganized her bookshelves twice. She tried to read 3 different novels and abandoned all 3 partway through because the words kept sliding off her attention without sticking, which had never happened to her before. She called Priya more than usual. She sat by the kitchen window sometimes with her coffee and watched the street and did not do anything in particular, which felt strange at first and then gradually started to feel like rest. The poster was on a telephone pole outside the post office. She had gone to mail a birthday card and almost walked straight past it, and then something at the edge of her vision caught her. She stopped, small, printed on ordinary paper, a little sun-faded, attached slightly crooked. It said, "Volunteers needed. Ridgemont Wildlife Sanctuary. All experience welcome. No experience also welcome. Come as you are." That last line stopped her. Come as you are. She stood on the warm pavement and read it twice more. It sounded like something said by someone who actually meant it. Not come prepared, not come useful, just come as you are. She took a photograph on her phone. She drove home and looked at the photograph on and off for 3 days, opening it, studying it, putting the phone down, coming back to it. Then she called the number. The sanctuary was about 40 minutes from town, past where the suburbs gave way to farmland, and then to mixed forest, where the roads narrowed and the trees grew tall on both sides, and the air changed in a way she noticed before she could name what it was. Cooler, cleaner, like it had not been through very many things before reaching her. The property came into view gradually through the trees. A long gravel driveway, fences running alongside it, the tops of low buildings with corrugated metal roofs visible beyond. Not beautiful in any polished or curated sense. Functional, honest, built by people who spent their resources on what the place was for, rather than on how it looked from the outside. The woman who ran the day-to-day operations was named Yemi. She was in her early 40s, compact and fast-moving, with a quality of calm that Nadia immediately recognized as something earned rather than natural. The calm of someone who has handled enough genuinely hard situations to have concluded, from experience, that panic is not a productive tool. She had been at Ridgemont for 11 years. She was the head keeper. She trained every new volunteer herself. In the first week, because she believed the habits you form in the first week are the habits that stay. The training was thorough and practical and entirely unglamorous. Nadia learned how to fill feed containers without cross-contamination, how to do a proper visual check on an enclosure, how to read the difference between an animal expressing curiosity and an animal expressing stress, which turned out to be a distinction that looks obvious from a distance and is much less obvious in practice, and which experienced people have gotten wrong with serious consequences. How to move near the enclosures, slowly, without sudden changes of direction, without reaching through any fence under any circumstances. To keep her eyes low, near predatory animals, because direct eye contact reads as challenge in the language most of them speak. To hold still when an animal is alarmed rather than retreating sharply, because sharp retreat can trigger pursuit in certain species. On the third day of training, Yemi stopped them on the path near one of the medium enclosures and said, "Look at that fox. Tell me what you see." Nadia looked and said, "He seems curious, maybe." "Alert," Yemi said. "Look at the body again, not just the face." Nadia looked more carefully. The fox was sitting with his weight slightly back, not leaning forward, his tail tucked close to his body, rather than held loose, his ears not quite settled. She said, "He's braced. He's not curious. He's alarmed. He's expecting something he does not want." Yemi said, "Right. A curious fox leans forward. This one is waiting for something bad. That is the distinction you need to read from 40 feet away through a fence in bad light. By the time it is obvious at close range, you are already in a different situation." Nadia wrote that down in the small notebook she had started carrying that week. She went home that evening and sat with it for a while. She thought about all the times she had assumed she knew what a student was feeling from the surface of how they looked, and how often the surface had been misleading. The student who always seemed fine, the one who was difficult and angry, the one who was very quiet. The surface and the thing underneath the surface are often two different things, and which one you respond to determines almost everything about what happens next. And she learned the most important thing, which Yemi told her on the second day of training, in a quiet, deliberate voice that communicated its importance more clearly than any emphasis could. Never assume you know what the animal is feeling. People come here thinking that being kind to an animal will make it trust them. Kindness as a concept means nothing to a wild animal. What means something is consistency. The same person, at the same time, with the same approach, day after day without variation. Trust is not a feeling for them, it is a pattern. A pattern that holds long enough becomes something they can rest in, and a pattern that breaks, even once, even by accident, can undo months of work in a single afternoon. Nadia listened carefully and did exactly what she was told. She was good with her hands and better at patience than she had expected. By the end of the first week, something that had been held tight in her for a long time had begun to ease. She was somewhere specific, doing something specific, with both her hands and her attention fully required. She had not realized how much she had missed that until it came back. She also noticed that she was sleeping better. Not more hours necessarily, but more completely. The sleep of someone whose body has actually been used during the day. She was not used to this. During the school year, she often slept badly, turning over the same concerns, replaying conversations, running lesson plans in her head at 2 in the morning. Here, she was tired in the clean way of physical work, and the tiredness was simple, and it did its job. The first time she saw Kodiak was on the 5th day. She had finished her evening tasks and was walking back along the main path toward the buildings when she turned a corner and stopped. The isolation enclosure sat apart from the rest of the sanctuary, behind an extra layer of fencing. A large red sign, "Danger, do not approach, authorized personnel only." Yemi had mentioned it briefly in training. A wolf, bad condition, not ready for any human contact whatsoever. If you had to pass near it, walk quickly, eyes forward. She stopped. Something in the far corner of the enclosure her brain could not immediately categorize. A shape, large, very still. She thought at first it might be a pile of equipment or some kind of low structure. Then it moved, a small, slow shift of weight, barely anything, and she understood it was alive. The distance was real and the light was going, but she could see enough. A wolf, gray, enormous in the specific way that large wolves are enormous, a size that does not fit your existing mental category for animal even when you are expecting it. Lying with his back toward her, parallel to the fence, completely still except for that one small shift. Then he turned his head. 2 yellow eyes across the distance and the wire fencing. She had expected something fierce in them. Aggression, alarm, territorial warning. There was none of that. Just a flat, very steady, very old awareness. The look of something that has seen enough of people that it has run out of particular feelings about them and settled into something closer to indifferent recognition. She had not expected that. She had expected something defensive in his posture, the tightly held, compressed shape of an animal bracing for a threat. What she saw instead was something more like the opposite, a stillness so complete it had no tension in it at all. He was not braced. He was not preparing anything. He was simply there, in the way that a very large and very tired thing is simply there when it has decided there is nothing worth reacting to. She stood there for 11 seconds. She counted without deciding to count, the way you sometimes discover you have been holding your breath only when you finally let it go. Then she made herself walk away. That evening she asked Yemi about him. They were putting equipment away at the end of the shift, and she asked as casually as she could manage. Yemi could clearly tell it was not casual, and chose not to point that out. She put down what she was holding and told the story the way she told hard things. Straight and exact, nothing added and nothing softened. The wolf had come to them 8 months ago from a wildlife seizure in Montana. He had been confiscated from the property of a man who had acquired him illegally as a pup and kept him for years as what Yemi called, with the flatness of someone who has genuinely run out of adequate words for a thing, a status symbol. A man with money and land and a specific kind of pride that needed the most powerful and dangerous available creature nearby to feel like something. He had not treated the wolf with what the law would call direct active cruelty. The case file was careful and worded accordingly. But he had kept him isolated, displayed him from a distance on occasion as part of how he presented himself, and had at some point, for reasons nobody ever fully established, put a muzzle on him. Not for a veterinary reason, not temporarily, just permanently. Because he wanted to, and there was nothing and no one to prevent it. By the time wildlife authorities came for the animal, the muzzle had been on him for so long that removal was not a straightforward matter. The metal had oxidized. In several places it had partially bonded with the fur and soft tissue around his jaw. The wounds at the device's edges had healed badly, the skin thickening and scarring around the metal rather than recovering normally. He had been wearing this thing long enough that it had become part of the physical structure of his face. The first veterinary examination after the seizure had required 6 people holding the wolf down and had still not been completed because he had fought with his entire body and everything he had, not from viciousness, but from the lived experience of a creature that has never been handled gently and has no framework for the possibility that being handled might not end in pain. He fought the way something fights when it has learned from long experience that whatever is happening to it is going to hurt. When he came to Ridgemont, the sanctuary director made the medically responsible decision: full sedation, a certified wildlife veterinarian, a formal and properly supervised procedure to remove the muzzle and assess the damage beneath it. This was the right call. It was the safe call, and it required paperwork, permissions across multiple organizations, a certified wildlife vet for large predators to be identified and scheduled, coordination across calendars that did not all belong to the same person. The paperwork had been filed 8 months ago. The muzzle was still on him. Nadia asked one question when Yemi finished. "Is he in pain?" Yemi did not hesitate. She said, "Yes, every day. The device restricts how far he can open his jaw. He cannot eat the way he should. He has adapted to the restriction. Animals always adapt to what cannot be changed, but adapting to pain is not the same as not being in pain. We believe he has been hurting every day since before he arrived here." Nadia said goodnight and walked to her car and sat in the driver's seat for a few minutes before starting the engine. Something had shifted, not loudly, quietly, the way a lock turns when the right key finally finds its angle. She went back the next evening, not into any restricted area. She found an overturned plastic storage crate near the equipment shed and carried it to the perimeter path and set it down about 20 feet from the outer fence. She sat on it, opened her book, and began to read aloud. She had always read aloud when she was alone, a habit from childhood, her mother's theory about information sticking when you hear your own voice saying it. She read to the evening and the enclosure, and whatever might be listening. He did not come close that first night. He stayed far back. She could barely see him in the fading light, but she stayed for 40 minutes, reading steadily at a normal conversational pace. And when she stood up to leave, she was certain, in the way you are certain about things you cannot prove, that he had been listening. She came back the next evening, and the one after that. The book was a memoir by a woman who had walked the entire Pacific Crest Trail alone, starting in the kind of personal difficulty that makes a person desperate enough to do something enormous just to feel like they are moving, and arriving, months later, in a different condition. Nadia had read it before. She returned to it sometimes when she needed to remember that walking through something hard, without knowing what was on the other side of it, was something a person could do. She read it in her ordinary speaking voice, not performing it, not directing it anywhere particular, just reading, just present. The 31 evenings had a shape to them when she looked back. Not a dramatic shape, a gradual one, like the slow accumulation of something between strangers who see each other every day. Nothing said, nothing formally decided, just the repeated fact of presence building over time into something that resembles, from a distance, familiarity. The first 9 evenings he stayed far back in the enclosure, not retreating when she arrived, not coming forward either, just occupying a middle distance that kept her within his awareness without putting her inside whatever radius he held around himself. She could feel the attention even when she could not clearly see him. It was in the quality of the stillness from that corner of the enclosure, not the emptiness of an uninhabited space, but the charged quiet of something watching. On the 10th evening she noticed he had turned slightly toward her, still 40 feet back, but angled so both eyes could take her in equally, rather than one eye catching a sideways view. She wrote it in the small notebook she had started carrying. On the 13th evening it rained. She stayed anyway. He stayed where he was. She had half expected rain to reset something, to push him back to the far corner, to undo several evenings of gradual movement. It did not. He was in the same position as the evening before. She understood from this that his position was not passive. It was decided. He had determined where he was willing to be, relative to her, and rain was not a reason to revise it. On the 4th evening she had looked up and realized he had moved, from the far corner to a position considerably closer to the fence, without her having seen him move. She kept reading. On the 9th evening he was already near the fence when she arrived. She came around the corner and there he was, not pressed against the wire, not crowding it, but positioned near it, watching her from the moment she came into view. His posture was something in between retreat and approach that had no clean word for it, but that felt, if she had to name it, like reluctant presence, the posture of a creature that had told itself not to care and found itself showing up anyway. She marked this in her notebook that evening with a single line, "Present at fence on arrival." She had been keeping the notebook since the 2nd week, and she was careful not to overinterpret what she wrote in it, not to turn small observations into larger narratives than they could support. But presence at fence on arrival was a fact. It had not been true on the 1st evening or the 2nd. It was true now, and it had become true gradually, and the gradualness of it was part of what made it real. She sat on the crate, opened the book, and read. He watched. That was the arrangement. The morning visits were different from the evenings in texture. The light was different, of course, flat and cool, the day not yet committed to what it was going to be. But it was more than that. Something in the morning visits had a quality of ordinariness that the evening ones did not quite have. In the evenings, she came with intention and her book and things she had been saving up to say. In the mornings, she just came. Coffee and the morning and the two of them on either side of the fence breathing the same cold air. Those visits felt, over time, like the less performed ones, like the difference between having a conversation with someone and simply being in the same room. On the 14th evening, the sanctuary director found her on the path. He was polite and not unkind. He explained that the area near the isolation enclosure was off-limits to volunteers, for reasons beyond just physical safety. The animal inside had been through severe trauma. Uncontrolled human contact, even at a distance, could set back the slow work of stabilization. He hoped she understood. She said she understood. She moved the crate to a spot technically outside the boundary he had defined, and she kept coming. She was not a rebel by nature. She had spent 5 years inside an institution, and she understood how institutions needed rules. But she had also learned to ask not just whether a rule was being followed, but whether the thing the rule was designed to protect was actually being protected. The protocols existed for the welfare of the animals in the sanctuary's care. The animal in the isolation enclosure was suffering every single day. What she was doing, sitting on a crate outside a fence reading aloud to the evening, appeared to be slowly and incrementally making something better. She was not willing to stop. She was aware, as the evenings accumulated, that she was making a choice she had not been given permission to make. She thought about this honestly and regularly, because she was not someone who was comfortable with the idea of doing what she wanted, under cover of doing what was right. She considered whether she was rationalizing, giving ethical cover to a choice that was really just preference, really just attachment to what she had started. She decided, carefully and not without doubt, that she was not. She made this decision on the grounds that what she was doing was so close to nothing, and what it appeared to be accomplishing was so clearly in the direction of less suffering rather than more, that the ethics of it were not genuinely ambiguous to her, even when the protocols were. She also decided that if at any point it became clear she was wrong, if Yemi told her directly that what she was doing was making the wolf situation worse, or if she could see any evidence of that herself, she would stop without argument. She was not invested in being right. She was invested in the outcome. She had learned, from years in a classroom, that those two things are not the same thing, and that knowing which one you are actually attached to determines almost everything about how you make decisions under uncertainty. She also thought about Yemi's warning. Be careful of what you are building. She thought about it often. She understood completely what Yemi was telling her, that a bond formed in a place like this, without the institutional structure to support it, could end in a way that cost the animal more than the bond had given it. She had seen versions of this in teaching, the student who trusted a teacher completely, and then the teacher left, and the student had to rebuild from a lower place than they had started. The bond was real, and the loss was also real, and the question was always whether the real thing was worth the real risk of the loss. She did not know the answer to that question in any abstract sense. She only knew it in this specific case, with this specific animal, on this specific fence. She thought it was worth it. She kept going. On the 17th evening the light was different, flat and gray, and completely even, the kind of winter light that has no angles and makes everything visible from every direction at once. He was facing toward her, which was not usual, and she saw the muzzle clearly for the first time. She had known about it since Yemi told her. She had been aware of it every evening on the crate, but knowing something abstractly and seeing it in full light are different experiences. The metal was dark in places with rust. It ran along both sides of his jaw and over the bridge of his muzzle, and connected at the back of his skull with a locking mechanism that was clearly not designed for what it had been used for. Not designed for a living animal, not designed for long-term wear, not made with any consideration for what continuous contact would do to the tissue underneath over months and years. She could see the places where the device pressed hardest, the ridge of scar tissue along his cheekbones where the metal sat against the bone, the corners of his mouth where the edges had been long enough to permanently alter the tissue there, the patches where the fur grew wrong or did not grow at all because the skin underneath had been under sustained pressure for too long to grow anything normally. From 20 feet away, through wire fencing, in flat gray light, she could see the history of what had been done to him written into the surface of his face. She let herself look at all of it. The things you cannot look at fully are the things you cannot think about clearly, and she needed to think about this clearly. She was angry, the settled, quiet kind, the kind that does not raise its voice and does not go away. She thought about the man who had done this, not with the kind of anger that needs a target and a release, but with the quieter, more durable kind that simply acknowledges a fact. Someone had done this, deliberately, to a living creature, and had done it across years, and the years had been real years inside which the creature had hurt every single day. She did not know what the right outcome was for a person who did something like that. She was not the person who needed to decide that. What she knew was the outcome for the animal, which was visible in the tissue of his face from 20 feet away, and that was enough for the anger she had. It did not need more. It had exactly as much as the situation required. She had thought, before that evening on the crate when she first talked to him, rather than reading to him, that what she was doing was a kind of waiting. Sitting on the crate with her book was, she had told herself, a way of being present while something else did its work. A way of being there so that something could happen, eventually, when the conditions were right. She understood on the 17th evening that this had been wrong. What she was doing was not waiting. It was working. Every evening of it. The reading aloud, the low voice, the steady presence, the not asking for anything back. These were themselves the thing. They were not preparation for some other moment. They were the moment, repeated, accumulated, building towards something she could not have named but could now feel the shape of. She put the book down and she talked. She had long since stopped pretending she was not talking to him. She told him about a student from the previous year, a girl who had walked into her biology class in September with the flat, absolute certainty that she was not capable of science, not false modesty. A genuine belief, built over years of being told in various ways, directly and indirectly, that the answer was not in her. Nadia had not tried to argue her out of the belief. She had just kept showing her, week by week, that she already knew how to look at something carefully and record what she saw. That the skill was already there. By December, that student was writing the most detailed observation journals in the class. Nothing new had been added to her. Something that was always present had just been given enough room to become visible. She had thought, before this evening, that what she was doing on the crate was a kind of waiting. She understood now that it had always been something else. It had been a kind of speaking, every evening of it. The reading aloud, the low voice, the steady presence, these were not ways of passing time until something happened. They were themselves the thing that was happening. The communication was not in the words. It was in the consistency of the voice. In the fact of it, evening after evening, unhurried and undemanding, asking for nothing back. She talked about Priya and her directness and how much she missed having her close when things were hard, even though Priya's directness was regularly uncomfortable. She talked about the trail memoir and a passage she had marked and returned to, the author counting her own footsteps through a featureless stretch of route just to have something small and repeatable and controllable to hold on to when everything else was too large. Nadia said, "I think I understand that now. The counting, the small steady thing that tells you that you are still moving." She talked until the light was fully gone. Her voice stayed level and quiet throughout. When she stood up and looked at the enclosure, he was 10 feet from the inner fence. He had moved while she was talking, in increments so small that none of them had been individually visible. And now he was 10 feet from the wire, lying with his front paws extended and his head resting between them, and his yellow eyes steady on her face. The expression was something she had stopped trying to translate into human terms. She let it be what it was. Complete attention, unguarded, present. She said goodnight, quietly, the way you say it to someone in the same house. Then she walked away. After that she started coming twice a day. A shorter visit in the morning before her shift, 20 minutes, sometimes less, and the longer one in the evenings. He appeared within minutes of her arriving each time, in the same position near the fence before she had even settled onto the crate. She had no way of knowing how he knew she was coming when she was still around the corner and out of sight. She accepted it the way you accept certain things about animals, as a fact that does not require your comprehension in order to be real. On the 22nd day, Kodiak lay down 3 feet from the inner fence while she was there, on his side, loosely, the way an animal lies when it is not braced for anything, head up. Yellow eyes on her, 3 feet of space between him and the wire, and then the wire itself, and then 20 feet to where she sat. And yet the feeling of that evening was of closeness, real closeness, the kind that does not depend on proximity. Yemi came by the path one afternoon and watched for a while without speaking. Then she said, "In 18 months here, he has not done this with anyone, not with any staff member, not with any authorized visitor." Nadia said she knew. Yemi looked at her and said, "Be careful, not careful of him, careful of what you are building here. When a bond forms between a person and an animal in a facility like this, and the institution around them cannot support what that bond requires, the animal always pays the price. That is how it always ends when it ends badly. Be careful." She thought about Yemi's 11 years at the sanctuary, and about what those years meant in terms of things seen. Yemi had seen animals arrive in terrible condition and had watched them improve, slowly, over months and years of careful work. She had also, probably, seen the other version, the bond formed between a person and an animal that the institution could not hold, and the falling apart of it, and the cost to the animal. Yemi was not warning her from theory, she was warning her from something she had watched happen. Nadia held that, she held it and kept coming. Nadia heard every word, she understood it completely. She also could not stop. She drafted a formal written request to the director at the end of the 3rd week, factual, documented, unemotional, timeline. Citations from the intake veterinary report. Description of the observed tissue damage. A request for a specific committed date for the procedure. The director thanked her. The procedure was progressing through appropriate channels. Scheduling was complex. He appreciated her dedication. She asked, "Can you give me a specific date?" He said, "Not at this stage." She nodded and left his office and went back to the crate. She filed a complaint with the Regional Wildlife Welfare Board on the 29th day, found the contact information on the state agency's public website. The letter was direct and specific, exact dates, the 9-month gap between the initial veterinary recommendation and the current date, a description of the progressive tissue damage she had personally observed, and a plain question about whether the current timeline met the welfare standards the board was responsible for enforcing. 2 days after she sent it, the storm came. It had been in the forecast for 2 days, but the forecast had shown something moderate. What arrived was not moderate. By 6 in the evening, the wind was strong enough that the tall trees along the northern boundary were bending in long, sustained arcs. The director sent most of the staff home. A small team stayed for final checks. Nadia had stayed. Nobody had told her directly to leave, and she had not done her evening reading yet. She had done it every evening for 31 consecutive days. She was not ready to let a storm break that. She finished her tasks and walked down the perimeter path. The wind pushed hard from the north, strong enough that walking into it required a slight forward lean. Her hood was up, her thermos in one hand, her book under her arm. The trees were very loud. The sky to the north had the specific dark of something heavy and solid on its way. She was almost at the outer fence of the isolation enclosure when the power went out. Everything, simultaneously. The backup generator was designed to engage within 30 seconds. During those 30 seconds, the sensor panel mounted on the outer wall of the isolation enclosure's corridor, part of the property-wide emergency monitoring system, received the power loss signal and executed its default emergency protocol. This panel was designed to detect fires and structural failures. Its programmed response to a power loss event that matched its emergency parameters was to release the lock on the inner gate of the isolation enclosure, allowing it to open freely. This was a safety feature built into the system years earlier by engineers thinking about the specific scenario of a building fire. If the structure was compromised, the animal inside needed to be able to exit. The logic was sound in the context it was designed for. Nobody had thought carefully enough about what it would look like in a scenario that was not a fire, a scenario where a volunteer happened to be standing in the outer corridor on a dark, windy Tuesday evening when the lock released. The gate clicked, the backup generator engaged, the lights came back. In the returning light, Nadia could see the inner gate of the isolation enclosure standing open by about 4 inches. She did not move. It was not fear alone that held her still, though fear was part of what she felt. She did not move because she made a decision, very quickly, her body making it a fraction of a second before her conscious mind caught up. Any sudden movement was wrong. Any sharp sound, any shift in her that would register to him as threat or flight. All of those things wrong. She stood exactly where she was and breathed slowly and kept herself completely still. Kodiak was standing just inside the threshold of the inner gate. He had been near the gate already, she realized, before it opened. He was there when the lights went out, and now, in the restored light, he was still there, standing at the gap in the gate, looking at her. She would try to describe what she felt in that corridor many times in the years that followed, and she would always say she cannot quite reach it. What she had expected to feel was fear, and the fear was there. She does not pretend otherwise. She could feel her heartbeat everywhere, but fear was not the dominant experience. The dominant experience was something she has tried many words for and settled, eventually, on calling complete presence. Every part of her entirely in that corridor at that moment. Nothing held back, nothing off thinking about something else, a quality of being entirely here that she had not felt in longer than she could clearly remember. The wind on the roof of the corridor was very loud, the generator lights were pale and steady. Everything between them was quiet. She said his name, Kodiak, quietly, not a command, not a summons, just the word, said the way she had been saying it to herself for 31 evenings. An acknowledgement. I know who you are. I have been here. I am still here now. He stepped through the gate. One step into the outer corridor. Then another. He moved with the same deliberate, placed quality that she had come to recognize in him through 31 evenings of watching. Each step considered, nothing careless. He came until he was about 6 feet from where she was standing and stopped. He raised his head and looked at her. She was close enough to see the real size of him in a way that the fence had always mitigated. Close enough to see the gray of his coat and the yellow of his eyes and the dark metal of the muzzle and the scar tissue at its edges. She could smell him. She had not prepared for the smell, the deep, warm, complex animal smell, and underneath it, distinct and metallic and wrong, the smell of oxidized metal in contact with a wound that had been slowly failing to heal for years. She was already talking. She had not decided to talk. Her voice had started on its own, the same low, even, unhurried register she had been using for 31 evenings. All the urgency stripped out. Just sound, the familiar, steady presence of her voice, as a fact in the air between them. He took another step toward her, and then one more. He came until he was close enough that she could have reached out and touched his shoulder without fully straightening her arm. He stopped, and then, slowly, carefully, very slowly, he lowered his head. The muzzle was inches from her hands. She understood what this was. She cannot explain with any precision how she understood it. She was not a trained animal behaviorist. She had a biology degree and 5 years of teaching and 31 evenings on a plastic crate. But she had been paying full attention for every one of those 31 evenings, and she understood, in the way you understand certain things below the level of reasoning, exactly what was being offered to her in this corridor at this moment, not as a symbol or a metaphor, as a plain and physical and immediate fact. Her hands were shaking. She reached for the clasp. It was at the back of his head. To reach it, she had to bring her arms close to his jaw, slowly, continuously talking in the same low voice. Not words, just sound, just the steady, familiar presence of her voice, as something unhurried and constant in the air. She found the clasp with her fingertips and understood immediately, from the feel of it, how long it had been in place. The metal was rough and thickened with corrosion, the mechanism stiff, with the particular resistance of something that has not been moved in a very long time. She worked it with her thumb and first finger, gently first, finding the direction of its logic, the way it was designed to open. It resisted. She increased the pressure carefully, without forcing anything. She was not going to rush this. She was not going to hurt him in the act of ending what was hurting him. He was absolutely still. His breathing was warm against her wrist, each exhale carrying the metallic smell of the muzzle sight. His body was warm in the cold air of the corridor. He stayed exactly where he was, head lowered, while she worked, and she worked it carefully and patiently, without hurrying and without forcing, the way she did everything she cared about. She found the angle. She pressed. It held. She adjusted slightly. She pressed again, more steadily. It gave. She felt the release, the exact moment the mechanism let go. She eased the muzzle forward slowly, sliding it away from his jaw, the way you ease something off someone sleeping whose face is beneath it. Careful and continuous, and without any sharp movement. She felt it come free. She held it in both hands. It was heavier than she expected, much heavier. Kodiak opened his jaw, first a small opening, cautious, the way something opens that has been closed for so long it has half forgotten how, and then wider, testing the range of it, finding the new space available to him, and then fully, completely, all the way, a jaw opening to its full natural extent for the first time in years. He exhaled, a long, slow, complete breath through a mouth that was open the way it was meant to be open, through a jaw that belonged entirely to him again, with nothing restricting it. His body did what it was built to do. Air moved where it was supposed to move, just breath, just air. The completely ordinary, completely enormous fact of a living body doing what it was made for. She was crying. She had not decided to cry. The tears came the way they come from relief rather than sadness, quietly, without drama, a body releasing something it has been holding. Her hands were shaking badly. She held the muzzle and kept herself steady. She stood in the corridor for a moment after he turned back. She was aware of holding something in her hands that was extremely heavy, and also aware that the heaviness was not entirely physical. She was aware that what had just happened was going to be very difficult to explain to anyone who had not been there. Not the mechanics of it. The mechanics were simple: a clasp, a muzzle, a gate that opened because a sensor panel failed in a storm. The mechanics were easy. What would be difficult to explain was the other part. The part where an animal that had not let any person close to him in years lowered his head toward a woman standing in a corridor and stayed completely still while she removed the thing that had been hurting him every single day. She thought about Yemi's 11 years at the sanctuary, and all the things Yemi had seen in those 11 years that had not been the things she had just witnessed. She thought about all the staff members and volunteers who had stood near the fence of the isolation enclosure and felt the particular texture of his refusal, the flat indifference of those yellow eyes, and had understood that there was nothing to be done there that was not already being done. She thought about the paperwork in the drawer, and she held the muzzle in both hands and she breathed. He stood with her for a little while. She did not reach for him further. She let the moment be exactly what it was, which was already more than enough. And then he turned, with the same unhurried deliberateness with which he had come, and walked back through the gate and into the enclosure and lay down just inside the threshold, with his front paws extended and his head resting between them. After a moment, his eyes closed. She stood in the corridor for a long time, long enough for the rain to start in earnest, drumming on the roof above her, long enough for her legs to begin shaking alongside her hands. Long enough for Yemi to come running down the path with a flashlight, called back by the power failure alarm, and stop when the beam found Nadia standing there, with a rusted muzzle in both hands. Yemi stood very still for a moment. She moved the light from the muzzle to the gate, which was still open, from the gate to the enclosure, where Kodiak was visible just inside the threshold, lying quietly, eyes closed. From the enclosure to Nadia's face, she said, "Is he okay?" Nadia said, "Yes." He walked back in on his own. Yemi said, "And you?" Nadia looked down at her shaking hands. She said, "I think so." Yemi came forward, and very gently took the muzzle from her. She held it in the flashlight beam and turned it over slowly. She looked at the corrosion. She looked at the places where tissue had bonded to metal. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, mostly to herself, 8 months. 8 months, this has been sitting in a paperwork queue. And then nothing else. They stood together with the rain loud on the roof, and the wind loud outside, and Kodiak quiet in the enclosure. And there was nothing that needed to be said. The investigation was handled properly and thoroughly. Nadia came in and gave her full account. The 31 evenings, the 2 written requests, the letter to the welfare board, the storm, the gate, the corridor, the clasp, the exhale. She told it factually and completely. The director listened without interrupting. When she finished, he told her he had to suspend her volunteer privileges pending a full review. He said it without anger. She said she understood. He said, what you did was a serious protocol breach that placed you in significant physical danger regardless of the outcome. She said she knew. He said, the animal is showing behavioral responses we have not seen from him in 18 months here. That does not change the nature of the breach. She said she understood that too. He paused for a moment. Then he said, I'm glad you were there that night. Officially, I have to tell you that what you did was reckless. But I am glad you were there. She picked up her bag and walked out. A wildlife veterinarian came 2 days later to examine Kodiak's jaw properly, with instruments, at close range, without sedation. This had been impossible before Tuesday evening, and the vet noted it in her report as a significant clinical fact. What she found was significant: extensive tissue damage throughout the jaw, areas where scar formation had altered the muscle structure, a range of motion reduced to approximately 60% of normal. With time and targeted rehabilitation, most of the function could be recovered. Some could not. Some things done to a body for long enough become part of its structure. Her report said, prolonged mechanical restraint applied in a manner not medically indicated, resulting in significant and preventable long-term injury. Preventable. Nadia read that word months later when someone sent her a copy. She sat with it for a long time at her kitchen table. During the suspension, she called Priya and told her everything, from the poster on the telephone pole to the muzzle in her hands. Priya listened without interrupting, which was unusual enough for Priya that Nadia noticed it as a form of respect. When she finished, Priya was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Do you know what strikes me most about this?" Nadia said she did not. Priya said, "You did 31 evenings of sitting on a crate before you did anything. 31 evenings of just being there. And when the moment came, you were ready for it, because of all those evenings." The moment in the corridor was not what it was because of the corridor. It was what it was because of everything that came before it. And none of those evenings looked like anything from the outside. They just looked like a person reading a book near a fence. Nadia thought about this for a long time after. She thought about it in the context of teaching, where the moments that matter for a student, the moments where a long confusion finally resolves, almost never happen because of the specific lesson where the resolution arrives. They happen because of the 12 lessons before it. The steady accumulation of the same person, with the same patients in the same room. The lessons that look like nothing are the ones that make the other moments possible. Priya said, "Write it down, not a formal document. Write it the way you just told me, like you're talking to someone who was not there and needs to understand it completely." So Nadia wrote it, at her kitchen table over 5 evenings, in longhand first and then typed. She wrote about the poster and the crate and what it felt like to sit outside a fence in the dark, reading aloud to something the institution had decided to be patient about while the paperwork progressed. She wrote about the muzzle in the flat gray light. She wrote about the corridor and the clasp and the exhale. She wrote about the 8 months and the gap between what the institution intended and what the institution produced. She did not make anyone a villain because they were not villains. They were people moving at the pace that processes move. The pace had been too slow. The cost had been paid by the one who had no voice in any of it. She sent it to a small wildlife welfare journal. She had no particular expectation of what would happen. The act of writing it had been its own thing, separate from the question of whether it would be published or read. She had written for an audience that was herself, at first. Not herself as she was now, but herself as she had been on the evening she walked up to the sanctuary for the first time and read the poster. She had written for that person, someone who was tired in a specific way and was looking for something real to do with the tiredness. She thought there were probably many people who fit that description. She wrote for them. She rewrote the section about the corridor 4 times before she was satisfied with it. Not because the facts were complicated, the facts were simple, but because she could not find the right tone. Every version was either too dramatic, making it sound like something more cinematic than it was, or too clinical, flattening it into a sequence of events from which all the texture had been removed. She wanted something in between, accurate, unhurried, present in the same way she had tried to be present in the corridor itself. She got there eventually, in the 4th draft, by stopping trying to describe what she felt and simply describing what she did and what happened. The feeling, she found, was already there when you did that. It did not need to be added separately. It was published the following spring. And then, in the gradual way that true things sometimes accumulate attention, people read it. People in animal welfare organizations, in regulatory roles, people thinking about how institutions with genuinely good intentions can still organize themselves in ways that produce harm. The piece was referenced in a policy discussion. She was asked to speak at a panel. She had never spoken at a panel in her life. She said yes. The panel was a regional wildlife welfare conference. A few hundred people in a hotel ballroom, mediocre food, hallway conversations afterward that were where the real exchange happened. She spoke for 14 minutes and answered questions for another 20. Someone from a regulatory body asked about the paperwork delay specifically. What in the process had permitted a 9-month gap between recommendation and procedure? She said she thought the honest answer was that nothing in the process had required the gap to close. The process required paperwork to be filed, and the paperwork had been filed. It did not require the paperwork to produce an outcome within any particular time frame. The absence of a deadline was not an oversight in the system. It was the design. That observation seemed to land differently for different people in the room. Some nodded in the way of people who already knew and were relieved to hear it said plainly. Some looked slightly uncomfortable in the way of people who had a role in designing such processes and had not previously considered them from this particular angle. She did not point at anyone. She just said what she had observed, as precisely as she could, and let people draw what they would from it. The review concluded about 6 weeks after the incident. Her volunteer privileges were formally terminated. The breach had been real, and institutions have rules, and rules that bend when the outcome is good are not really rules. She understood this and did not contest it. The other outcome was quieter. The sanctuary's protocol for animals arriving in prolonged mechanical restraint was revised. A 30-day maximum from intake to removal procedure was established, with formal escalation required for any extension beyond that. An internal document, not a press release. Yemi sent her a short message. The protocol changed. Thought you should know. She kept the muzzle. It went into a cardboard box on a shelf in the spare room. She does not take it out often, but knowing it is there does something she has tried many times to describe precisely and has never quite managed. Ballast, maybe. The physical weight of the difference between a process being in motion and a problem actually being solved. The reminder that patience and delay look identical from the outside right up until the moment you look at what they have each cost. She thinks about it sometimes, years later, in meetings about problems that have been acknowledged for months and are still moving slowly toward solutions that keep shifting further ahead on the calendar. She thinks about the weight of it in her hands, the clasp that held and held. Kodiak's rehabilitation took nearly a year, done entirely on his timeline, because anything else had already been shown to set the work back. His jaw healed, mostly. His range of motion recovered, mostly. He remained wary and remained difficult and had days when even Yemi had to leave the enclosure and try again the next morning. He did not become a wolf who trusted people. He was a wolf who had been damaged by people in deep and lasting ways, and deep lasting damage does not dissolve in a year of careful attention. It changes, slowly. It loosens into something that can be lived with. There is a meaningful difference between those two things. About a year after the corridor, someone at the sanctuary sent her a short video filmed from outside the fence, slightly grainy from the distance. Kodiak, running, not from anything, not after anything, just running, full speed the length of the enclosure, then turning, then back again. His jaw was open. His body was covering ground the way it was built to cover ground. He was not wild and free the way a wolf is supposed to be wild and free. That was not possible, not after everything, but in the space he had, he was running. His body was doing what it was made for. She watched the video 4 times. She put the phone down and looked out her kitchen window for a while. The street was entirely ordinary. A car going past, a neighbor walking a dog she recognized, the late afternoon light, doing what late afternoon light does at that time of year. And inside her, something that had been holding itself very carefully since the corridor finally let go. Not dramatically, just a release. The small proof that a year of cautious work by careful people had moved something real. Not everything, not enough, but something, enough. She thought about calling Priya to tell her about the video and then decided against it for that evening. Some things are better held alone for a while. The experience of watching Kodiak run with his jaw open did not need an audience or a conversation right at that moment. It just needed to be true, and it was true, and she let it be true quietly, in her ordinary kitchen, and that was enough. She went back to teaching that autumn, not because she had resolved everything or healed every tired place. She went back because teaching was work she was good at, and work that mattered, and because she had understood something during the year that reframed the work without changing what it was. The tiredness she had felt before the sabbatical had not been about the teaching itself. It had been about the kind of patience she had been practicing inside it. The head down, process trusting, don't push too hard patience that looked like professionalism and was sometimes just a way of avoiding the question that needed to be asked. She asked that question more often now. Not loudly, not in a way that made every situation a confrontation. Just, is this actually working? Not, am I following the right procedure? Not, is the process in motion? Is this actually working? Right now, for whoever is on the receiving end of it. It is a small question. It sounds almost obvious when you say it out loud. It turns out that asking it honestly and consistently changes a remarkable amount about how you do almost anything. The change in how she taught was not visible in any obvious external way. She did not rearrange the classroom or develop a new methodology she presented to colleagues. She just began doing something she had known she should do more consistently and had not. She stopped, more often in the middle of something, and she looked at the actual faces of the actual people in the room, and she asked herself, not them, herself, whether what was happening was actually reaching anyone, or whether she was moving through the motions of a lesson while the people who needed it remained somewhere she was not quite getting to. Sometimes the answer was fine. Sometimes the answer was, not this one, not today, try something different. She trusted the second kind of answer, and she changed direction in the middle of class without making a production of it. Her lessons became less predictable. Her students found this mildly disorienting at first, and then, she noticed, more engaged. People pay attention, she observed, when they can tell the person in the front of the room is actually paying attention too. She spoke at more events in the years that followed. She wrote more pieces. She stayed a high school biology teacher in a small town in Oregon. She was not famous. She did not become a wildlife expert or a professional advocate or any of the things a story like this one might suggest a person should become. She just went on being a person who paid close attention and who had learned the difference between patience, that is waiting for the right moment, and patience that is just waiting. She still eats toast for breakfast most mornings. Her car still makes the noise her mechanic called concerning but not yet urgent. Priya still calls and says the true thing directly, and Nadia still finds this both difficult and necessary in roughly equal measure. She still reads aloud when she is alone, which her students have noticed and which she has stopped explaining. The box is still on the shelf in the spare room. She has been asked many times, in the years since, whether she regrets it. Whether the suspension and the lost volunteer position were worth it, given that the outcome was good but the breach was real. She always gives the same answer, which is that she cannot cleanly separate those two things in the way the question implies. The breach and the outcome were part of the same act. The act was, go to the enclosure on a stormy Tuesday evening because you have built something over 31 evenings that is fragile, and you are not willing to abandon it, even temporarily, even for a storm. The outcome of that act happened to be an open gate, and a corridor, and a clasp finally giving way. The outcome could have been different. She knows this. She has thought about what the other versions of that evening might have looked like, and she does not pretend the version that happened was the only possible one. She just knows it was the one that did happen, and she knows what it cost, and she knows what it ended, and she would not undo it. She does not open it often, but sometimes, when she is in a meeting about a problem that should have been addressed 6 months ago, when she is watching something go slowly wrong while the right people work through the appropriate channels, she thinks about the weight of the muzzle in her hands, the clasp that held and finally gave, the exhale, and she asks the question, how much longer? It is a small question, 4 words, but 4 words asked in the right room at the right time, asked consistently and honestly, and without giving up when the answer is uncomfortable, can change things. Not always, not immediately, but often enough, and significantly enough, that the question is worth the asking. She learned this from 31 evenings on a plastic crate outside a fence in the dark. She has not forgotten it. There is a moment that changes things, a gate that opens by accident in a storm, a woman who chooses to stay still, a breath held for years, and then, finally, let go. That is the whole truth of this story. And the truth is not complicated. It is just a person, on a crate, outside a fence, in the dark, who chose to keep showing up. She is aware that the story, as she tells it, sounds more certain than it felt in the living of it. The 31 evenings were not 31 evenings of steady conviction. They were 31 evenings of showing up while not knowing whether showing up was right, whether it was accomplishing anything, whether the whole thing was a form of self-deception that she was going to have to account for eventually. The certainty, such as it is, came afterward. It came from the outcome and from the writing of it, and from the conversations in hallways at conferences with people who understood immediately what she was describing. But in the doing of it, it felt like most things that matter, uncertain, incremental, held together mainly by the decision to continue. She thinks sometimes about what would have happened if the gate had not opened, if the storm had not come in larger than forecast, if the sensor panel had not run its emergency protocol in those 30 seconds of backup power transition, whether the muzzle would eventually have come off another way, through the official procedure, through the welfare board pressure, through some combination of things that would have resolved the paperwork delay eventually. She thinks it probably would have. The process was not permanently blocked. It was just slower than the injury could afford. The storm and the sensor panel and the open gate were not the reason the muzzle came off. They were the specific moment in which what was already in motion arrived somewhere. That is, when you get down to it, almost always enough. Not always, but almost always. The thing required is usually not genius or exceptional courage or an unusual gift. It is the willingness to come back the next day, to sit on the crate, to read the next chapter aloud in the dark, to whatever is on the other side of the fence, whether or not anything visible is happening, whether or not you have any confirmation that it is making a difference. The willingness to continue in the absence of evidence because you can see clearly enough what the cost of not continuing would be. That is the whole skill. That is the whole story.